but there are places where my values and their values will overlap, even if it's just as simple as we both love North Carolina and we're trying to take care of its people. And so I think the willingness to drop the ideology and get down to the pragmatism is a way to be able to work across party lines.
Hi there, I'm Jesse Mayshark, and this is Headlights, Voices from the Progressive South. This podcast is a production of the Progressive South, a nonprofit media company dedicated to amplifying progressive voices and values across the southern United States. Voices like State Senator Greg Meyer of North Carolina. That was him you heard at the top. We had a really interesting conversation about advocating for progressive goals in a state legislature dominated by conservative lawmakers who have worked to marginalize dissenting views. That's coming up later in the episode. Also, in our Arts and Culture segment, we'll talk about an exhibit at the Kentucky Center for African American Heritage that pays tribute to black jockeys in the country's most famous horse race. If this is your first time listening, you can find out more about us in our first episode and on our website at theprogressivesouth.org. Now it's time for our weekly news roundup. This week, we're taking a look at the latest crop of legislation across the South aimed at blocking efforts to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion, or DEI. Many Southern state legislatures have ramped up attacks on diversity efforts over the past 5 years, as they've become favorite targets of conservative commentators and culture warriors. These attacks prefigured and in many ways laid the groundwork for the broader assault on DEI currently being waged at the federal level by President Donald Trump and his appointees. The 2025 legislative session has brought a fresh round of anti-DEI bills across the South, many of which share a central irony, or perhaps it's more accurate to just call it cynicism. In seeking to limit efforts to foster diversity and reduce socioeconomic disparities, they are using the language of the civil rights movement to attack its core achievements. Most conservative-dominated states in the South have seen a range of bills in recent years, aimed at public schools, universities, and state agencies, all alleging in various ways that any efforts to recognize or remedy the legacies of legally enforced discrimination in the South, or in some cases even to discuss that history, amount to forms of discrimination themselves. This year's State House sessions have been no different, although not every anti-DEI bill passed. In Georgia, for example, the state Senate approved a bill that would have placed a raft of restrictions on how schools talk about race and gender and American history. Among other things, it would have forbidden public schools and universities to promote or maintain, quote, any programs or activities that advocate for diversity, equity, and inclusion. As examples for colleges and universities, it restricted any institutional support for a laundry list of terms conservative lawmakers apparently find offensive, including, quote, unconscious or implicit bias, cultural appropriation, allyship, gender ideology or theory, microaggressions, group marginalization, anti-racism, systemic oppression, social justice, intersectionality, neopronouns, heteronormativity, disparate impact, racial privilege, sexual privilege, or any similar or related formulation of these concepts. In other words, the state where Martin Luther King Jr. was born into a legal system of racial oppression was proposing to make it legally hazardous for universities to talk about systemic racial oppression. But after clearing the Senate in the final days of the session, the bill stalled in the state House, which was scrambling to finish its own priorities. It could well return next year, of course. Another anti-DEI bill is moving through the Louisiana legislature, hitting on some of the same themes as the Georgia bill. It would restrict any hiring preferences in state agencies based on race, sex, gender identity, or sexual orientation. It would also restrict state universities from mandating course content dealing with certain topics, again including a list of conservative rhetorical bugbears. Quote, instructional content that relates to critical race theory, white fragility, white guilt, systemic racism, institutional racism, anti-racism, systemic bias, implicit bias, intersectionality, gender identity, allyship, race-based reparations, or race-based privilege. The bill does have language protecting individual faculty members' rights to shape their own curriculum and choose their own instructional materials. It also says that it will still be legal to teach about U.S. historical events, including slavery, the forced removal of Native Americans, and Japanese-American internment during the Second World War. Still, as in Georgia, it is remarkable to see a state like Louisiana take issue with concepts like systemic or institutional racism. New Orleans was one of the national centers of human trafficking in enslaved people up until the Civil War. It was also home to Homer Plessy, famous as the losing plaintiff in the case of Plessy v. Ferguson, in which the U.S. Supreme Court gave its blessing to Jim Crow regimes of racial segregation. It is hard to think of more obvious examples of systemic and institutional racism. That bill is up for a vote this week in the Louisiana State Senate. In Tennessee, meanwhile, the state's General Assembly passed a set of bills in April aiming to, quote, dismantle DEI in state and local governments and education systems. Tennessee had already passed versions of curricular restrictions in previous years, forbidding the teaching of what it calls divisive concepts around race and gender. This year's bills focused more specifically on hiring practices, prohibiting the consideration of race, gender, or other personal characteristics in employment decisions. They also forbid state or local governments or schools from maintaining departments or programs to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. The Texas legislature is considering a bill much like Tennessee's, although it is limited in scope to the state's public schools. It forbids the consideration of race, sex, or ethnicity in hiring decisions, or the assigning of diversity, equity, and inclusion duties to school employees. That bill passed the Texas Senate and is awaiting a vote in the state House. If all of these bills sound fairly similar, so does the rhetoric surrounding them. The Republican legislators who have sponsored the bills uniformly depict them not as a tax on diversity, but as protection against state-mandated discrimination. In Georgia, State Senator Max Burns said that his anti-DEI legislation should be embraced by people who want to see racial equality. According to the Georgia Recorder, on the Senate floor, Burns said, quote, DEI is the antithesis of equality. If you believe in equality, if you believe in equal opportunity, this bill does not strip you of that, it enhances it. The sponsor of the Louisiana bill, State Representative Emily Chenevert of Baton Rouge, responded to criticism of her legislation from other lawmakers by saying, this is not divisive. This is protecting every Louisianan. This is about equality for all. And in Tennessee, State Representative Aaron Mayberry said his dismantle DEI bills were similar to past efforts to fight workplace prejudices. If discrimination in the past was wrong, and I agree it is, then discrimination today is wrong, he said. And here's where the rhetoric around all of these bills becomes tricky. Like Mayberry, the bill's sponsors, and conservative anti-DEI pundits and activists in general, suggest either explicitly or implicitly that they are fighting against some kind of widespread patterns of discrimination under the guise of DEI programs. They allege that diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts, which can include everything from workplace anti-discrimination training to job fairs that aim to reach traditionally underrepresented groups, actually end up promoting a different kind of bigotry. They rarely say it plainly, but what they mean is that majority groups, or groups that have traditionally been overrepresented in government workplaces or in leadership positions, which is to say white people in general, and white men in particular, and especially straight white men, are now themselves victims of discrimination. The problem with that assertion, and perhaps the reason it is rarely stated quite so directly, is that there is very little evidence to support it. The reality is that any kind of discrimination in hiring on the basis of race, ethnicity, or gender is already illegal throughout the United States, and has been since the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. That act, of course, was one of the crowning achievements of the civil rights movement, and was fiercely opposed by white Southern conservatives, the same political demographic that is now passing their own versions of anti-discrimination laws, but with a very different class of alleged victims in mind. Like everyone else in the country, white men are already protected against employment discrimination on the basis of race or gender. Like everyone else, if they believe they have been discriminated against, they can file complaints with the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. And some of them do. Just not that many. A large study in 2019 found that about 25% of black women said that they had experienced some form of workplace discrimination, compared to 18% of black men and 16% of white women. Only 11% of white men said they had. Meanwhile, a 2023 study of U.S. Fortune 500 companies found that 59% of company executives were white men, even though they make up only about 30% of the total U.S. population. 20% of Fortune 500 executives were white women, 14% were men of color, and just 6% were women of color. The breakdown of company board members and people in corporate governance followed nearly identical pattern. Over and over in the American workforce, white men remain overrepresented in top-tier positions and underrepresented in reporting incidents of being discriminated against. It may not surprise you to know that another place white men are overrepresented is among Republican state legislators in the South. In Georgia, for example, 96% of the Republicans in the General Assembly are white, and 85% of them are men. In Tennessee, 86% of the GOP supermajority in the legislature are white men. In other words, these bills alleging discrimination against white men are being written and passed by Republican majorities that are overwhelmingly and disproportionately made up of white men. That's why the political minority parties in southern state houses, which also include most of their legislators who are women and people of color, have tended to see the anti-DEI movement's true aims as perpetuating racial inequities rather than fighting them. They allege that what the bills are really trying to do is create chilling effects that will make people in state agencies and schools think twice about hiring anyone who isn't a white man, and afraid to discuss any kind of racial or gender disparities. In Georgia, Democratic Senate Minority Leader Harold Jones II, who is black, accused the state's Republicans of wanting to, quote, take Georgia backwards to days when people did not have full rights. In Louisiana, State Representative Edmund Jordan said the state's anti-DEI legislation was, quote, an anti-black bill. And his fellow Democratic State Representative Candace Newell said, this is the most racially oppressive piece of legislation that I think I've seen. Jordan and Newell are both black. So is Tennessee State Representative Antonio Parkinson, a Democrat from Memphis, who said during debate on the dismantle DEI bills that Republicans had created a false narrative around DEI. It is simply to show you that we exist, he said. It removes the invisible cloak from veterans, disabled individuals, black people, women, and others. We exist. And that is maybe the most irrational thing about the wave of attacks on diversity in the South. Most of these states are pretty diverse. Non-white residents make up 1/3 or more of the population in 9 out of 12 southern states. In Texas, non-Hispanic white people make up only an estimated 39% of the total state population. In Georgia, it's 49%. And in Louisiana, it's 56%. Even Tennessee, one of the whiter states in the country, has a non-white population of nearly 30%. And like the U.S. overall, we're getting progressively less white. Every southern state has become more racially and ethnically diverse over the past 30 years. Whatever else the anti-DEI movement accomplishes, it doesn't seem likely to change that. Okay, now we are to this week's interview with North Carolina State Senator Greg Meyer, who represents the area around Chapel Hill, home to the flagship campus of the University of North Carolina. It is among the state's bluer political areas, and he is among the state legislature's most reliably progressive members. He is in his first term in the state Senate after serving 8 years in the state House. He is one of 20 Democrats in the Senate, which has a 30-member Republican majority. Partly with the help of controversial district lines, Republicans maintain a significant edge in the legislature. They also control 71 of 120 seats in the state House. Those are much larger margins than Republicans appear to hold among state voters overall. Although North Carolinians have voted for the Republican candidate in the last 4 presidential elections, they have all been by less than 4 percentage points. They have also elected Democrats in the last 3 gubernatorial elections. It's a politically interesting state. and Meyer is an interesting legislator. I met with him in his tiny office in the North Carolina Legislative Building in Raleigh, which, for all you modernist architecture buffs out there, is a 1963 landmark designed by the great Edward Durrell Stone. Meyer talked about how his background in social work and education led him to seek public office, how he seeks to be effective as a member of a legislative minority, and why he helped start a new North Carolina media company just a few years ago. So with that, Seth, let's go to the tape.
My guest today is North Carolina State Senator Greg Meyer, a Democrat who has represented the 23rd State Senate District, which covers part of the Chapel Hill-Durham area, since 2022. Before that, he served as a state representative for more than 9 years. Senator Meyer grew up in Cleveland, Ohio, the son of 2 social workers. He pursued social work himself, earning a master's degree at the University of Chicago. He then moved to North Carolina, where he worked as a school social worker and became involved in advocating for education policy at the state level. His political engagement eventually led him to seek appointment to a vacant seat, and he has been in the state legislature ever since. He still works as an education consultant while representing a district made up of 3 counties, which includes the campus of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He has long billed himself as a pragmatic progressive, advocating for issues including education, healthcare, reproductive rights, and environmental protection. We'll talk a little about that phrase, pragmatic progressive, and what it means in practice in a state where conservative Republicans control the legislature. Senator Meyer, thanks for taking the time to talk.
Absolutely, Jesse.
So, as I said, your parents were social workers. Can you tell me a little bit about what work did they do? What was your understanding of their work as a child, and kind of how did that influence you growing up around that?
My dad worked mostly in housing and economic development, which is not what people think of for social workers. But if you think about the way that social workers want to work for people to have economic opportunity and other opportunities in their life, it can make a little bit more sense. My mom worked mostly in child welfare roles, but both my parents were also active politically, and my mom was probably the most active in that she was often running campaigns for women who were running for office and trying to elect more women into office. But I think maybe the biggest thing with my parents was making the intentional choice to raise a family in a mixed race, mixed income neighborhood in the city of Cleveland, and dedicating that, living their values by sticking in a neighborhood that wasn't the easiest neighborhood to grow up in the 70s and 80s, but trying to make it a better place.
And so at what point did it become a conscious decision for you that you wanted to do something in social work yourself?
Well, when I got to college and I looked around and I saw that most of the kids I had grown up with in my neighborhood didn't go to college, I really wanted to understand why. And so in undergraduate, I studied sociology and anthropology and really focused on the study of inequality, which then led me to wanting to do something to make a difference for neighborhoods and kids in the neighborhood like the one I grew up in. And ultimately, the choice was to go to social work school and to try to focus on using social work skills to help with youth development, which led to working in schools. And what I did most of my time in schools was to run a program for students who would be first generation to go to college. And I loved college access work and really liked that focus on opportunity for kids and their families.
So the path from Cleveland to Chicago doesn't seem that hard to understand, sort of one Great Lakes city to another one. What then brought you to North Carolina? And as somebody myself who moved to Tennessee from the Northeast when I was in my 20s, did you come with any preconceptions? What did you expect to find when you came to North Carolina?
Well, I mean, it would be warmer would be one thing, right? That's a good reason to move out of the Midwest. But also, at the time that I came here in the late 1990s, North Carolina was really considered to be on the cutting edge of public education. And that was a big draw, was wanting to be part of that. North Carolina has a slogan, call our state the beacon of the South. And it really was a beacon to me. Like, there's a place to go where you can be working in public education on values forward, progressive and moving policy. It was going to be relatively easy to get a job here, where it wasn't easy where I was in Chicago. And North Carolina has always been a great place to raise a family. And at the time that I moved here, my former wife and I were in the process of adopting our oldest child, and we wanted a place where we would have an interracial family. And the South, it turns out, does pretty well on interracial relationships when compared to the North on a lot of things. People in the North think that the South is a horrible place full of racism, but we had a lot of friends that had adopted transracially in the North and had a very difficult time with it, whereas interracial families in the South are pretty much the norm.
Right. It goes back a long way.
It's
a complicated history, but it's
very
a real
complicated,
history.
But people know how to talk about it, deal with it, and support it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so what then? When did you really start to feel like this was home? You've been here more than 20 years now, I guess. Like, at what point did North Carolina shift from being a place you had kind of moved to the place you were going to stay?
I mean, I had been here 15 years when I got into the legislature, and when I got into the legislature, the thing that occurred to me was that I loved the community I was living in, but when you're representing when you're in the legislature, you represent one part of the state, but you serve the entirety of the state. And I had a real thought of like, I need to figure out what I love about North Carolina as a whole, not just the Chapel Hill community that I was living in. And I spent a lot of time thinking about like, why am I so drawn to these mountains? What is it that I love about the people of this state? What are the complexities of this state, the paradoxes of this state that I find so intriguing? And that was the piece really that drew me in. And I bet that every state has this. I certainly know that most faith traditions have this. But like, when you're part of a deeply rooted, long-time community, you have to grapple with all the paradoxes that are within it. So in this state, we love to debate Eastern versus Western barbecue. We love to debate mountains versus beaches. We love to debate Carolina versus Duke. We love to debate Charlotte versus Raleigh, urban versus rural. There's all these things. I love the debate. I love the fact that people feel so passionately about it. I love that we'll argue with ourselves on it, but then all turn against South Carolina and how terrible their yellow barbecue is. And that piece of like North Carolina loving itself for the paradox and for the rivalry was great. And all of those things are kind of the surface level things. But then for me, as someone who's dedicated my life to racial justice, it's also a deep history here. A deep history of battles and leaders who have won tremendous victories for racial justice. Incredible leaders, including other white men who have been great leaders for racial justice that I've learned from in this state, and also some really terrible figures, including some that are in office today, and people who try to forestall the progress of racial justice. And so, for someone not born here, I certainly have, at the very least, become someone who's a student of what the culture of this place is, for all its good and all of its bad.
Mm-hmm. So you've been in the legislature now for long enough to have seen some shifts in North Carolina politics, also at the national level, obviously, and the interaction between those. What has changed the most about the legislature since you first arrived in it?
Well, I came after Republicans won the majority, and I've been in a Democratic minority the entire time that I've been here. I've been into and then out of and then back into again super minorities. I'm currently serving in a super minority. When we had a Democratic governor, Roy Cooper, and we had broken the supermajority, the Republican supermajority, that was kind of the height of what we were able to get things done. And there were a few big bills that happened during that era, including Medicaid expansion and a major piece of environmental legislation about the energy sector, committing the state to carbon neutrality in the energy sector. I mean, those were big victories that we had just because we had a Democratic governor, even with the Republican legislature, and we were able to negotiate some things. But when serving in a super minority like I do now, I'm much less hopeful about big legislative wins. My job is to do what social workers do, which is to represent people who are marginalized, vulnerable, oppressed, living in poverty, etc., and give voice to them and make sure that even if I can't win the vote for them, that their voice is heard, and that the people who are pushing forward policy that may be harmful know that they're doing it while someone is watching and speaking up on behalf of those who might not be able to be here on the day that the law is being passed.
Well, and that gets into kind of the idea of pragmatic progressivism. I guess what does that phrase mean to you, and how do you put it into practice, especially in, say, a super minority position? Because there could be different approaches. I mean, there could be sort of like, standing up and making speeches because somebody needs to make the speeches. It can be building the relationships behind the scenes with people in the other party. Like, how do you approach that?
Yeah, I mean, when I was in the House, one of my favorite compliments that was ever paid to me was the Democratic floor leader walked off after a debate one day and shook his head at me and said, "I do not understand how you can cuss them out on the floor today and they'll keep working with you tomorrow." And it is that example. I mean, it's what you just said, right? Like, my floor arguments, my public statements are always incredibly values forward and principled. That's the way I try to present things. I'm trying to lead in ways that connect to people's heart and their gut, and then reinforce with logic. I'm not trying to make them feel stupid or evil. I'm trying to be as persuasive as I can, even knowing that I won't likely change a vote. But at least that way, like, they know where I'm coming from. And then behind closed doors or just out of the spotlight, it doesn't have to be like in secret, but just walking in the hallways or talking to somebody before or after a committee meeting, I try to approach everyone with a warm and welcoming heart, be straightforward with them. And one of the ways that I've been most effective over time is to be able to say to a Republican colleague who's working on an issue where we have at least some agreement, to say, "Hey, this bill that you have, I think there's a lot of good in here. Here's a couple of particular things you might consider. You either want to add or take out or wonder about the impact of this." And that type of collegial help is very normal in any legislative body. If you've broken down to the point where you can't have that type of conversation, you're in a really bad place. But ultimately, that advice that I'm giving them is pragmatic. It is absolutely from my values-based perspective, but there are places where my values and their values will overlap, even if it's just as simple as we both love North Carolina and we're trying to take care of its people. And so I think the willingness to drop the ideology and get down to the pragmatism is a way to be able to work across party lines. It's harder in the Senate. That was all House examples. But the Senate is different because of the way that leadership works and power moves in this chamber.
Uh-huh. Well, so let's talk a little bit about kind of the state of play right now here. You are in session. This session kicked off just as the second Trump administration was coming back into office, but at the same time that another Democratic governor was sworn in here. From the perspective of a state like Tennessee, which has a Republican supermajority in the legislature and a Republican governor, and Democrats are mostly reduced to kind of shouting from the margins, a place like North Carolina can look like, oh, well, they have a little bit more representation there. What does it feel like here politically? How is this session going? And what, if any, impact or influence are you feeling from what's happening in Washington?
Here in the legislature, the dominant issue this year is recovery from Hurricane Helene. I know that's also playing out in Tennessee. And our new Democratic governor, Josh Stein, is leaning almost entirely into hurricane recovery in his early stage leadership. And he is publicly and privately emphasizing his leadership on that issue by working directly with Republicans both here in the General Assembly and in Washington, D.C. I understand why he's doing that. I want him to be a governor who isn't consumed by just one issue but leads broadly for the whole state. And I want him to be a governor who leads with values and not just the pragmatism, and it is pragmatic, of working across the aisle with Republicans on this specific issue. And I think we just had his State of the State speech, And I think he was heavy on the pragmatism and pretty light on the values, and certainly was not provoking many fights with the Republicans. He did mention one important one, which is that the Republican tax policy here has us about to head into a deficit in 2 years based on our independent financial projections, and we really need to address that. I'm glad that he was willing to push them on that. But he is certainly not leading the resistance to the Trump authoritarianism and the direct harm that's going to come from the federal government to North Carolina because of job losses and cuts. I think he's quietly doing some things. He sent some letters. But for me, with my constituents, almost the only thing that I'm hearing about right now is the federal onslaught. And I don't have the ability to make direct impact there, but I'm trying to focus on how I can help those folks who do want to advocate on federal issues to find a voice to do so, and to use my voice to do so as well, whether that be publicly, some of which I've done at rallies and social media statements, and some of it privately. Like, I've had conversations with veteran Republican legislators here about what they're doing to lobby our Republican congressional delegation, and comparing notes on what do we need to do to make sure that we minimize harm to North Carolina.
What are you hearing from people at the universities, at the University of North Carolina and at Duke? I mean, there's a lot of major universities right around here.
Yeah, I mean, I have 3 counties, 2 of which are rural, one of which is the county where the University of North Carolina is. And since UNC is in Orange County, our entire economy is based on education and research. Like, that's it. And the federal government is coming after education and research, and it is going to be very damaging to our local economy. We're going to lose a lot of jobs. People like researchers, scientists, whether they be at the university or at our huge EPA facility here, these people have put a lifetime of work into trying to make this world a better place, and they might have their research just unplugged and destroyed. And that all makes me really sad. I'm worried about my people. And I think my job is to try to help make clear what is the harm that is being done, and to help other people to be able to move out of the shock and anger and frustration into clear action, advocating for change and drawing a clear picture of how harmful this is.
You mentioned Hurricane Helene, of course, probably the major story in North Carolina of the last 12 months. Environmental issues have been a major focus for you throughout your career. What do you think the state as a whole should learn from Hurricane Helene and the response and recovery efforts from it? Beyond just the immediate recovery, what do you see that maybe needs to be thought about looking ahead?
Well, I mean, I just can't believe that a state that will continue to be in Hurricane Alley has its head in the sand about climate change and the way that climate change is related to natural disasters. We've had major hurricane damage across this entire state, every piece of it, over the 25 years that I've been here. And we have other weather-related disasters that impact our state as well. And the willful refusal to think about how other policies could help reduce the impact of climate-related weather disasters is a real ideological problem with the Republican leadership that's here. And sometimes with the Democratic leadership, where Democrats are afraid to be, really clear about why we needed to talk climate and why we need to address some of the underlying challenges of climate change. We did a great bill a couple years ago on reducing carbon emissions in the energy sector. We need to do the same thing in transportation. Transportation contributes more carbon emissions than the energy sector does, and we need to have dramatic work on reducing the total number of vehicle miles traveled and increasing the use of electrified transportation and public transportation. And North Carolina is ready to be one of the leaders in making money off of electric transportation. So, it's in our best economic interest to do the same thing. And then, I think similar to Tennessee, like this is a state that has traditionally prioritized building new roads over building more dense communities and reducing the total amount of travel. And again, like I don't understand why people are not more willing to focus on density as a development approach rather than road-based expansion, because no one likes driving long distances in rush hour. And yet we just want to build more highways so people can drive farther to work. Nobody likes that. People like driving a short distance with little traffic to work, or maybe even riding on a public transportation conveyance where you can read a book or something instead of being in traffic at all. So there's just so many opportunities that we could take on that we're absolutely not.
The final thing I wanted to ask you about is Beacon Media, which you founded and which distributes coverage of state issues to media across North Carolina, provides it for free. And I gather you're not involved in the day-to-day editorial operations there, but what led you to create that, and in your mind, what are you trying to accomplish with that?
So the story is that I was writing a monthly newspaper column that was being published in the rural newspapers in the rural parts of my district. And those parts of my district are largely Republican. But when I would show up and meet people, they would often say to me, hey, we like it that you write to us. Nobody else tells us what's happening at the state level. And often people would say things along the lines of, I don't always agree with you, but I agreed with that one thing that you wrote. And people are looking for that level of engagement and agreement, and to be able to build common ground, especially in rural areas that feel left behind and want somebody from the state to be able to pay attention to them. And so Beacon Media is an attempt to use the existing media in rural spaces, Spanish language, Latino community spaces, and Black community spaces to be able to communicate directly to people about state issues and local issues through a values-forward perspective, a progressive values-forward perspective. I don't think we have to create new media to do that. All these places exist. Many of them need content. They don't have enough money to create content. So we're trying to create newspaper columns and radio shows as the two primary things to be able to show up in these places. It turns out that conservatives already do this. That in my rural newspapers, there are already syndicated columns from the right. And even where the owners are conservative, they're willing to take a column or two from the left because they're still a newspaper owner. They still believe in some type of balanced perspective. We may not get as many column inches as the conservatives get, but it's important for people from the left to show up, and it's important for us to talk directly to those communities. And I think that we can really shift the polarization in rural communities where Democrats have become such a bad name and a bad brand, and then in Latino communities and in Black communities. Those communities are so hungry for people to talk to their direct experience. And if we don't take the opportunity to talk to them directly, but conservatives do, then we're going to lose the perspective and support of those communities as well. So, it's an effort to say that let's go to where the people are, let's use the media that they use, and let's make sure that we're showing up.
All right. Great. Well, I think that's a great place to wrap up. Thanks again, Senator Meyer, so much for your time, and really appreciated your perspective.
Thanks for having me.
I mentioned earlier that only 3 of the southern states have populations that are more than 2/3 white. The whitest of them, demographically, is Kentucky, where an estimated 81% of residents are non-Hispanic white, and only about 8% are Black and 4% are multiracial. The state's largest African-American population is in its largest city, Louisville, which was home to the state's most famous Black native son, Cassius Clay, best known, of course, as Muhammad Ali. There is a street named for him there, Muhammad Ali Boulevard, and, fittingly, on that street you can find the Kentucky Center for African American Heritage, which celebrates the history and culture of the Bluegrass State's Black residents. In particular, I wanted to mention an ongoing exhibit there that opened last month. It's a quilt show, but an unusual one. Artist Eugene Poole Jr. has created a series of tapestries with images paying tribute to some of the best-known black jockeys to ride in the Kentucky Derby. They include Oliver Lewis, a black Kentucky native who won the very first Derby in 1875, riding a horse named Aristides. You can find a link to some images in the show notes. It's a subject freighted by Kentucky history. Black jockeys won 15 of the first 28 derbies, but the spread of segregation through the state by the early 20th century eventually forced them out. The last black derby winner was Jimmy Winkfield in 1901 and 1902. Poole's quilts feature colorful depictions of the jockeys, who all have shades of red and blue on their faces. The artist said, "I wanted to juxtapose those two colors. At times, they had to be docile because they had to survive. And then there was times when they were enraged about what was happening, either to them and their families, as teenage enslaved young men during the 1800s to 1900s. The exhibit of Poole's quilted portraits is on display at the center through July 31st. If you're in Louisville or are going to be visiting, check it out. That wraps us up for this week. Remember, the Progressive South is a nonprofit media outlet, and you can find information about contributing to our efforts on our website, theprogressivesouth.org. If you do feel moved to make a donation, first of all, thank you. And second, make sure you make a note in the comments accompanying it that it is for the Progressive South. Our donations go through our fiscal sponsor, Community Shares, who oversee contributions for several organizations. So please make it easy for them to know who it's for. Next week, we head to Atlanta to talk with a nonprofit leader who has experience in two distinct areas, criminal justice reform and community development. She'll tell us how those connect. Come on along. Thanks to Bark for our theme music, and to Lord Seth the Libertarian for his production work at Barbarian Productions. And thanks to you for listening. Remember, you can call and say hey from wherever you are. Just leave us a message at 865-214-7764. That's 865-214-PROG. Tell us your first name, where you're calling from, and take up to a minute to let us know what's going on where you are. We'll talk to you soon.